There were a couple of different thoughts I had about anger, and one was the idea of it being a childish sin. I mean, it starts off with this sort of out-of-tune piano and then wrong notes and then someone just bashing the keyboard with their fists like kids do. So it's very much about that sort of childish temper tantrum. And at the same time, this idea of I'm right and I've got it right, which very often I think that a lot of people who support causes, even though they may be good causes, are secretly doing so because they're just mad at the world generally. You know, they just generally are angry and they find something to channel it through. Because rock and roll is very good at expressing anger. I mean, it has a rather limited emotional range, I think, in a lot of ways, but it's very good at anger. So I wanted two drummers just thrashing away like maniacs, like gladiators, you know, competing with each other. And in addition to that, in the middle of the song, the scene sort of changes and we're suddenly in the middle of Times Square with traffic just roaring over our heads and everything is overwhelming. It's like the cars are angry, the lights are angry, the whole world is angry. And in the middle of that, you have this guy playing these plastic buckets on the street. I mean, all kinds of horrible things may be going wrong in the world, but you get really angry because you can't quite get the temperature right in the shower of the water. You know, this sort of, and it just explodes and it's completely irrational. Yeah, envy was another one that I initially had a problem with. I didn't identify with it all that much. I don't feel like I'm an envious person, but when I got into it more, I realized that being envied is actually a real problem too. You know, it's very, very damaging to people. And I had this idea of sisters, envy between sisters, partly based on the old story of Cinderella. I mean, a lot of these fairy tales are quite scary, actually. When someone envies you, there's nothing you can do. I mean, there's nothing you can do that's ever right, it's ever good enough. You know, anything you say is going to be twisted or resented or something. And you simply have to walk away from it. I mean, that's what happens in the song. I mean, she starts off saying, I'm trying all these things, I don't mean any harm, you know, I want to be your friend, etc., but nothing works. She's just rejected all the way down the line. And in the end she says, you broke the bridge on your side and I'm just walking away. And that's all she can do. I think that the first two sins of gluttony and lust are always the easiest to relate to. They're always popular. And they're considered to be the most human and most forgivable sins. Gluttony especially, I think it's actually hard to even think of it as a sin. But like most of the other ones, it becomes a sin when it's indulged into excess, or it sort of becomes an obsession that messes up other parts of your life or affects other people. You know, in Amadeus, the movie, there's a guy, the Archduke or the Emperor or something, tells Mozart that there's too many notes, my dear Mozart. And I thought it should start off with having too many notes, and so I built this very busy fugue, which just becomes almost excruciatingly full of notes. And it's supposed to represent excess. Writing about avarice or greed was the most difficult thing for me on this record, actually. It was the sin that I least identified with, because I guess I've just never really been interested in money or material things very much. And it's always been hard for me to understand. So I couldn't find a way into it, and then what did it was that I read an article in the New York Times about the war in Bosnia, but specifically about profiteering and people trying to make money out of this wartime situation. It's a scenario where every person has been reduced to whatever they have to sell or to trade. So that's what they become in a way. I mean, this person is a can of oil. You know, another person is 3 eggs. Another person is a pack of cigarettes. You know, it's just all reduced to a very basic material level, and all those voices are just sort of people that are caught in the crossfire, if you like. So this one is pretty grim. I mean, I think a lot of this record has a lot of humor in it. This one doesn't particularly, except in the blackest possible sense. This piece, Angel, which is about lust, it went through a lot of transformations. Because it started off being from the point of view of a sort of horny young guy who's completely confused by the whole thing and doesn't know which way to turn. And I had the idea of him having, you know, in old cartoons you see people with a little angel on one shoulder and a little devil on the other, tempting them in two different directions. And I had this idea that that's what would be going through his head. I mean, on the one hand, he's being tempted into total sleaze, and on the other hand, some kind of more spiritual, you know, higher plane is calling to him as well. As I got further along with it, I thought it would be nice to have two women's voices representing this sort of virgin and whore contradiction. And it ended up really being just the two women's voices for the most part, telling the story, and they're really sort of competing with each other. This piece about pride also starts with a fugue. It's a different kind of fugue, whereas the one in Gluttony is about excess. This one is about building up this. It's like building up an ego. It's a feeling of sort of serene confidence is what I'm trying to build up. As the song goes along, this feeling of serene confidence gives way to what was this sort of crazed, egocentric thing that really gets distorted. I mean, with each verse, the ego gets bigger and bigger until he ends up saying that he's God, basically. And that's where he's screwed. I mean, that's where the devil has got him by the short and curlies. I had this idea that sloth would be a passacaglia, which is an old variation form where you have a certain theme, which quite often is a bass line. In this case, it's a 20-bar bass line that you hear at the beginning, and it repeats itself over and over. And each time there are variations that go around it. So they go above it or below it. The idea that it just keeps coming back to square one all the time, never really goes anywhere. And I thought that was very appropriate for sloth. People say, well, why is sloth a sin? What's wrong with just being a slob in front of the TV? But there was nothing wrong with that. But to me, it's much more insidious than that. It's every time you hear someone say, hey, it's not my problem, or why bother? You know, or, hey man, lighten up. You know, like nothing's worth getting excited about. That's very much the sin of sloth, and it's extremely prevalent in the modern world, I think.